And welcome to this edition of The Scene Show. Great to be with you here, coming to you from Hudson, New York yet again. And just to give a brief update, I know that I haven't been posting or anything in the last few weeks. Things got busy with assignments, and then, 1 week led to 2 weeks, and I was still trying to come up with a topic, and then that led to 3 weeks, or however many weeks it's been. It's great to be back on the air. Now, I was, of course, at a loss for things to cover, and still trying to fine-tune my vision for the show, what I hope to accomplish and what I hope the show accomplishes, and just trying to work out the details of that, still trying to work out the details of that. And so that's kind of where things are. And that's sort of where I am with it, and so I just decided that I would focus this particular episode on something that I've been reading or rereading, and that is C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I'm going to focus this episode on sort of the first part of it, so it is going to be a little bit of a philosophy lesson. Kind of like the last episode was. If you listened to the last episode, then, well, first of all, thank you for doing that. We did 2 episodes on just war theory and the situation with China. So this one goes into a more general topic, and that is talking about the human being, right and wrong, and the moral law, and how the moral law ultimately leads us into talking about God. So stick around and don't go away. You won't want to miss it here, as we'll take a quick break, and then we'll get right into it here. And precious Lord, take my hand, bringing us into our discussion for today. And now, for those of you who don't know who C.S. Lewis is, or who C.S. Lewis was, C.S. Lewis was a great writer and scholar of English literature in the 20th century. He was a fellow and tutor in English literature at both Oxford and Cambridge, where in 1954 he was elected to the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge. So that's a little bit of his background, and he's known for writing the Chronicles of Narnia, fictional series, and he's also known for his non-fictional works of like Mere Christianity, The Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, and a host of others that he wrote on spiritual topics. He was a Christian. He was born in the Church of Ireland, and then became and fought in World War I, and became an atheist by the age of 30, and then he basically had a conversion experience with the Lord, and that changed his life, and he was received again into the Church of England. Back when the Church of England was actually more orthodox, more conservative, shall we say. And I'm not going to get into that. I don't intend to get into that, but I assume my listeners will know what I'm talking about. And so that's a little bit on C.S. Lewis and his background. And he was called upon during World War II to give a series of lectures on what Christians believe, and they were broadcast on the BBC, and this later became the book that we know as Mere Christianity. And so he starts Mere Christianity looking at right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And that's where and that's what I'm drawing upon for this episode, is talking about right and wrong. Because I know that we had talked last time on the issue with China, and we connected it to just war theory. And certainly you could make the argument that these episodes are connected in a way. And ultimately, the question you could raise is that, is China in the wrong? Is China in the wrong for not only wanting to annex Taiwan, but are they in the wrong for wanting are they in the wrong for suppressing the freedoms and the liberties of the people that they govern? Is China wrong to do that? Is it wrong for the Taliban in Afghanistan to forbid women from receiving an education? Was it wrong for Nazi Germany to imprison and kill Jews? Now, ultimately, to these questions, I assume we would all say yes to them. Now, looking at C.S. Lewis, he gives really more mundane examples for the moral law, or what he calls the law of nature, the law of decent behavior, whatever you want to call it. Of saying things like, of getting into arguments. He says that we get into arguments with people over right judgment, over things like how would you like it if someone did the same to you? That's my seat, I was there first. Leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. So it's things like that C.S. Lewis begins to talk about the moral law. And that's where we have this notion, he says, of right and wrong. That the human being has this notion, and he says that this notion spans across cultures, so that it spans across cultural differences, but that there's a common thread of moral thinking, and that if there are differences, they're not substantial differences. They're not essential different. They're not essential differences to the nature of the moral law. And so this moral law, as I understand Lewis's argument, is that it's innate to the human being. That in our existence, you have the notion of right versus wrong behavior. And now, obviously, just because saying that there's a moral law doesn't mean that you don't have examples of people who aren't moral. That's not it at all, but it's to say that this law is understood as what should be, or what ought to be, and we don't follow it. Lewis makes that clear, that we don't follow this moral law. We fall short of it. And so that everyone falls short of it, that there isn't one of us that doesn't fall short. And we have this notion in the culture today. You know, one of the things that's coming up coming down the road is that I'm doing a Bible study for Advent for the people of the parish in Hudson, talking about truth and talking about a few different worldviews in the culture that influence people's thinking, and we're going to look at the culture's view versus the Christian view in the study. And one of the things that I will say is that regardless of whether a person is religious or not, we have some notion of right and wrong. And we make these claims of absolutes, or what we call moral absolutes. We make these claims fairly often. And everyone has that sense of falling short, that sense that Lewis talks about of falling short of the moral law. We recognize that there's some good that we ought to do, yet we do not do it. And that sense of perfection versus imperfection is something that we carry with us, regardless of whether we're a Christian, whether we're an atheist, agnostic, what have you. I think you could even say Jewish, Muslim, looking across the spectrum of religious belief, that there's that sense of perfection versus the imperfection. And that's and many have used that as a small caveat. Many have used this as an argument for God's existence as well. That the perfect must exist if we ourselves are not perfect and yet have some semblance of what perfection is. And so we have the moral law. Staying on topic. We have the moral law, and there seems to be, it would seem to suggest that there's this power behind the moral law, and ultimately C.S. Lewis uses goodness, absolute goodness, to say that this power really is what we call God, because God is absolute goodness by definition, you see. So he goes from the moral law to saying that there must be a power behind the moral law, and that power seems to have that quality of differentiating between what is good and what is evil, or what is right and what is wrong. And so we call that God. And that, this means that ultimately it means that the moral law is impressed upon us by our Creator. And then if it is impressed upon us by our Creator, well, what does that mean for our lives? What does that mean, that ultimately how we answer these questions has every bearing on our lives. It seems like that I've done some kind of abstract philosophizing here, or preaching, but this question, these types of questions have every bearing on how we treat other people, on how we treat ourselves, on how we treat and ultimately our relationship to God. That these questions are not worth, they're worth more than just 2 or 3 seconds of your time. That we all answer these questions one way or another. Everybody has a philosophy which they live by each and every day, whatever it is. We all have some kind of worldview that governs our thinking, that governs our behavior. And so there's a very practical application of these, and a very practical implication. The implications are very practical for what we're talking about here today. That this is not meant to be an abstract lecture. It's meant to be something practical. It's meant to be something that I hope becomes real and apparent to you. that these are philosophical questions that must be answered, and indeed are answered. And I ultimately believe that the best answer to these questions come through the Christian worldview. And I'm sure that C.S. Lewis, he does agree to that as well, that the Christian answer is the best answer. And so we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back after more music. And there's a favorite hymn of mine, There is a Fountain. And there is a fountain indeed flowing for the sinner unclean. One of the other things that I've been reading over the past couple of weeks is the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. And the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes also has a similar outlook. And basically, Solomon says that he sought after wisdom, he sought after pleasure, he sought after all of these things. All of the things of life, ultimately, he came away finding them to be vain, to be meaningless, to be empty. And that's sort of where I want to end, or start to conclude this episode, is that life ultimately is meaningless without God. And C.S. Lewis makes a point of this by saying that when he says that atheism is too simple, because if the universe had no meaning, he says, we would have never discovered it to have no meaning. That ultimately he's saying that the fact that there is a meaning is an indication that God exists. That if the universe had no meaning, we would have never discovered it to have no meaning. We would have never realized it. Much like if I was constantly surrounded by the dark, in a dark room, he says, and didn't know the thing called light, I wouldn't recognize that I was in darkness. And so what I conclude with is that this sort of message from Ecclesiastes, and this sort of realization that everyone is forced to grapple with these questions of meaning, with these questions of purpose, with questions of value. What do I value? What's important to me? And ultimately, where it is found is in God. You know, I'm reminded of the quote from St. Augustine, who says that our hearts are restless, O Lord, until they rest in Thee. And you know, this is in such an interesting time in history with COVID and this pandemic and the world seemingly coming apart, you know, where we don't know what to do when the supply chain can't supply our needs. Everybody's worried that there won't be a Christmas this year because we can't get the newest iPhone, or we can't get the newest gadget our gifts are all floating on barges somewhere. Or, you know, the fact that there's all this talk of war with China, war with Russia, war with North Korea, or the polarization in the country, the polarization of the political system, where you have the right versus the left, the liberal versus the conservative, and there's so much division. And it seems like, you know, the country is coming apart. We've seen this past year with the Afghanistan crisis and that whole mess and all of these things. And I think it's an indication and a warning to us that we can't depend on those things. We can't depend on the government for peace and security. We can't depend upon our own will for our peace and security. But instead we must do as Augustine says, and we must find our rest in the Lord. For I'm reminded again of the words of Jesus, when he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy, and my burden light." And that's ultimately the truth. Because God calls us into a relationship with Him. A relationship with the God behind the moral law. That those wrongs that we've done can be forgiven at the cross. Because it is at the cross and that it is at the cross that right and wrong are met with the cleansing blood of Jesus. That fountain that the hymn writers sang about. And so if you're listening to this, I would ultimately urge you to call out to your Creator, to get in touch with the God who made you. Because ultimately all that we've said about the moral law and human existence reminds me of Romans chapter 1, where it says that God has placed eternity upon the human heart, that His invisible attributes are made known by what has been made. And eternity is pressed upon man's heart. For all must face the one reality of death. And that in that death, Christ has defeated death. Christ has overcome the world. That as Christians we have the new hope, the hope of the resurrection. And the hope of the resurrection overshadows any darkness from the pandemic, from the world situation. And it is in Christ that we place our undying hope. And so that'll do it for this this episode. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, on YouTube, on iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And may God be with you this week.